Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz. Peter, it's all yours.
Eric, thanks very much. I am joined by Senator Cruz. Thank you for the time. Appreciate you joining us here in Bloomberg this morning. Just mentioned the president's out there talking about a whole range of issues he thinks are going to help Americans move into the middle class. One of the issues he's been talking about is immigration reform, the need for immigration reform. Right now, House Republicans are meeting on the eastern shore of Maryland. They're talking about ideas as well for advancing these issues, including the possibility of giving legal status to those who are here in the country and undocumented. What do you make of that? Is that a move Republicans should be making at this point in time? Is this time for a compromise?
Well, Peter, I think it would be a mistake if House Republicans were to support amnesty for those here illegally. In my view, we need to secure the borders, we need to stop illegal immigration, and we need to improve and streamline legal immigration. As you know, one issue I fought very hard for is increasing H-1B visas. I introduced an amendment to increase the number of temporary high-skilled workers, H-1B visas, fivefold, from 65,000 to 325,000. Every Senate Democrat on the Judiciary Committee voted against that. I think those are the sort of reforms we ought to be looking at on immigration, securing the border, improving legal immigration. Amnesty would be a mistake.
Right now, the Wall Street Journal on editorial today says the right move for Republicans would be to compromise here, get this issue off the table because it's going to be better politics down the road. Why isn't that the right move at this point, given the political implications for Republicans?
Look, what we ought to be focusing on every day is the top priority of the American people. And the top priority of the American people is jobs and economic growth. You know, the State of the Union this week, it was striking throughout the entire speech. President Obama didn't acknowledge once that under his leadership, we have achieved the lowest labor force participation since 1978. His economic policies aren't working, and millions of Americans have lost their jobs, have been forced into part-time work, have lost their health care because of Obamacare. That's what Republicans need to be focusing on, and that's what President Obama should be answering on his tour, is actually taking account and acknowledging that the policies he's proposed hasn't worked and changing course rather than doubling down on failed economic policies.
We've got a debt ceiling showdown once again looming here. Is that going to be another opportunity for you and for other Republicans to wage their fights over some of these economic policies of the administration? Another opportunity to fight over Obamacare?
Well, if you get outside of Washington and you talk to any Americans, the answer is obvious. Of course, we shouldn't just raise the debt ceiling without making structural reforms to stop the out-of-control spending in Washington. When President Obama was elected, the national debt was $10 trillion. Today, it's over $17 trillion. It's now larger than the size of our entire economy. And what the president's saying is he wants a blank check. He wants to just keep borrowing and borrowing. And you know, it's important, Peter, to emphasize something, because we know how this will play out. The strategy that the president is going to try is he's going to try to scaremonger, and in particular he's going to try to scare the markets and suggest a default on the debt unless he gets a blank check to keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. Now, mind you, his borrowing so far has resulted in the credit of the United States being downgraded. But the simplest answer to that, I am a strong proponent of a bill Pat Toomey has introduced that I call the default prevention bill. It is a bill that says under no circumstances will the United States ever, ever, ever default on its debt. Regardless of what happens with the debt ceiling, we will always honor our commitments and pay our debt. The reason it hasn't passed is President Obama, Harry Reid, and the Democrats are blocking it because they want to scaremonger on the debt ceiling.
Well, let me ask you about the politics of that proposal, because it has been challenged by Democrats who suggest Ted Cruz and others who support it would like to pay China before they pay U.S. troops.
You know, you're exactly right. Harry Reid on the floor of the Senate attacked me on that and called it the Pay China First bill. You know, that's worth remembering, because those same Democrats come on your show and talk about how incredibly irresponsible it would be to default on the debt. And they try to scaremonger against Republicans. And then we say, great, let's always pay the debt. Let's never default on the debt. Then they say, oh, that's a terrible idea. Look, it's absurd. Of course we should pay our debt. But one of the things that people don't always realize is those in Washington, the president wants to play games. He wants to scare people because the alternative is to actually start living responsibly. The debt ceiling historically has been the most effective lever for spending reforms. Of the last 55 times the debt ceiling's been raised, 28 times there have been significant restrictions. Graham-Rudman, one of the most successful bills we've had to limit government spending, came through the debt ceiling. The Budget Control Act came through the debt ceiling. So, of course...
Are you spoiling for a fight here? Is this something we should be prepared to see you back on the floor with green eggs and ham or some other book trying to occupy the Senate and trying to convince your own leadership this is the time for a fight over the debt ceiling?
Look, of course we should enact major structural reforms and actually fix the problem. When I go home to Texas, the frustration that Texans express, and the same thing people express all over the country, is that politicians in Washington, in both parties, they aren't listening to the American people. They aren't solving the problems. The American people want jobs and economic growth. They want government to live within its means. And in Washington, politicians in both parties are ignoring them. So I intend to continue fighting as hard as I possibly can to make D.C. listen, to force this town to address the real problem so we can pull back from this fiscal and economic cliff. Because the window to turn this around is not long.
So when business leaders out there call on Ted Cruz and say, listen, Senator Cruz, we understand your fight for lowering spending, but the debt ceiling, the idea of America's creditworthiness, it is not worth risking that to wage that fight.
Look, I emphatically agree we shouldn't risk America's creditworthiness. We should never default on the debt. And by the way, any responsible president, the president has the authority to take a default off the table. In any given month, there are roughly $200 billion of tax revenues. Interest on the debt is $30 to $40 billion. So there are ample revenues to always meet the debt. Do you know what a responsible president would do? A responsible president would hold a press conference, look in the camera, and say, under no circumstances will the United States of America ever default on its debt, no matter what. I don't agree with what Congress is doing, but you have my word. We will meet our obligations. The president could do that. The reason he doesn't want to is he thinks it's politically advantageous to scaremonger. And to be honest, everyone on Wall Street, everyone in business who's worried about this brinksmanship needs to call the president to account, stop playing games with the debt ceiling, and the best way to do it, pass the Default Prevention Act so we could never again have any question of a possible default on the debt.
A couple other quick issues while I got you here. Speaker John Boehner, you haven't necessarily agreed with Speaker Boehner on a range of issues over the past 13 months that you've been in the Senate. Is he representing Republicans admirably, in your view, in the House of Representatives? Do you support John Boehner continuing as Speaker?
Oh, look, to be honest, I don't really know John Boehner. He has his job. I have mine. I will say this. I was proud of House leadership. I was proud of House conservatives this fall when they stood up and fought to defund Obamacare. They demonstrated principle and integrity. They listened to the American people. And sadly, it was Senate Republican leadership who abandoned House Republicans on the field and refused to support our House Republican colleagues. So I admire the leadership House Republicans showed there. And as a result of that fight, it elevated in the national debate the harms that Obamacare has caused. People understand all across this country now what an abject failure Obamacare is, and it set the stage, it set the preconditions for repealing Obamacare altogether because it's the biggest job killer in the country. It is hammering small businesses.
What's it going to take to convince you to run for president in 2016?
Well, you know, my focus is not on the political side. I know it's hard to believe. Everyone in Washington, it's all politics all the time. What I'm trying to do is do my very best to fight for 26 million Texans, the people I represent, and to fight for economic growth, jobs, and our constitutional rights. You know, this administration has demonstrated an abuse of power, a lawlessness, an assault on constitutional liberties that worries me. And so I'm focused on doing my job.
I don't hear you ruling it out.
Well, look, as you and I visited just earlier this morning, in 2016, my view as a voter is that I intend to vote for whoever is effectively standing up and leading, whoever is effectively fighting for free market principles, fighting for the Constitution, because we're really at a turning point. We're getting to a point of no return, and I believe we can turn this country around, but we are at the fiscal and economic cliff, and I would love to see dozens of candidates all over the country all following that model, standing up, leading, fighting for economic growth, fighting for free market principles, fighting for the Constitution. I can't think of anything that would be better for the country than seeing lots of people leading to pull this country back.
Final question, is Hillary Clinton going to be hard to beat?
Well, we'll see if she runs, and we'll see if she wins the nomination. If she runs, I think she's likely to get the nomination. But I think her path is going to be much, much more rocky than many in the media have predicted. Look, there's a natural pendulum to politics, that it tends to swing back and forth, and even more fundamentally, the Obama economic policies are not working. Millions of Americans have lost their jobs, have been forced into part-time work, have lost their health insurance, and I think come 2016, people are not going to want to double down on policies that have hurt so many people, and in particular, have hurt the most vulnerable among us. The ones who've lost their jobs, they've been young people, Hispanics, African Americans, single moms. They've been people like my dad was 56 years ago when he came from Cuba with nothing and washed dishes making 50 cents an hour to pay his way through college. If he'd been washing dishes today, he probably would have lost his job because of the massive taxes and regulations and burdens on small businesses. We need to fight for people like that 18-year-old immigrant washing dishes, because what's made America great is we've been a land of opportunity where millions of people have been able to come here with nothing and achieve anything. And right now, that opportunity has been sorely diminished under the Obama economic agenda.
Senator Cruz, we thank you for sharing your strong views with us here on Bloomberg. Look forward to having you back as well.
I look forward to it.
Eric, Stephanie, we'll send it back to you in New York.
Peter, thank you very much. That's our chief Washington correspondent, Peter Cook, with Texas Republican Senator Cruz. Senator Cruz leaving us guessing, I would say, Peter, as to exactly what he's going to do when the debt ceiling deadline comes around in a few days.
A politician leaving us guessing, that never happens. Peter